Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube. The stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks. Artificial intelligence seems to have found its way into almost every avenue of information access, where within the educational environment, we start worrying about the authenticity of submissions, the authenticity of work being produced by students, where a lot of faculty, a lot of professors, a lot of teachers, a lot of instructors aren't really worried about is the student learning anything per se from the submissions that they're making, but more are they worried about is the materials being submitted authentic? Are they actually being produced by the student or are they coming from artificial intelligence? With the worry not being is the student not learning the material, but are the grades that the student's earning actually reflective of the understanding the student happens to have? Where we spend countless hours in conferences, in meetings about what to look for in submissions to show that it's not coming from artificial intelligence, such as looking at references that are non-existent, very similar to what has been pointed out in some of the submissions seen within a lot of documentations being presented by committees within the government in an attempt to invalidate the use of vaccinations, where we spend this time, this effort, trying to pinpoint when do we see artificial intelligence versus when do we not see artificial intelligence, when do we see student work versus when do we see computer work, without actually answering or actually asking the question that we should be asking about the use of artificial intelligence. Is artificial intelligence actually making us less smart? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
The thing that we have to remember about school and about education is it's a learning experience. An idea or ideal that kind of falls short from the perspective that many students take into the classroom, where they feel that based off of all the negative reinforcers that are placed on them by administration, by faculty, by parents, by family, by society, that they have to be perfect. They have to get an A in their courses in order to show that they are learning, in order to show that they are smart. And so in order to achieve that, they go about utilizing secondary mechanisms of expression, secondary ways in which they can show what they think they know by submitting work that is inauthentic in an attempt to not necessarily cheat the system, but to expose the system for the flaws that are within the system. Where if we actually focus on the learning aspect of education and not on the assessment of education, where we look at the use of feedback as a means to improve understanding as opposed to a means to show that I am somehow deficient in what I'm trying to express, we can minimize the stress that the students face in terms of needing to be perfect or needing to submit perfect work, which is going to drive them to complete assignments utilizing the artificial intelligence, where they can use the ChatGPT, the Copilot, the Gemini that we see within the Microsoft Office programs, within the Google programs that are meant to be assistants too. The problem is that the students are using them as an avenue for expression. Not only are the students utilizing them for avenues of expression, but we're starting to see works being produced by non-students utilizing the artificial intelligence, where the students feel, okay, I'm completing the assignments. Since I'm completing the assignments, I must be doing the work that the student's supposed to be doing, because that is the kind of contract that I have with my professor, that I have with my instructor, that I have with my teacher, that I'm going to do this work. And by doing this work, I'm going to be sufficient in completion of tasks so that I can go ahead and get the A on the assignment, get the A in the class that I've been told that I have to get in order to be successful. Regardless of whether or not I remember anything 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 10 days, 20 days, 30 days after completing that assignment. We're seeing the use of the artificial intelligence in other avenues as well, like I was stating within the intro. We're seeing it within government reports. We're seeing it particularly within government reports that as related to the invalidation of vaccinations, where there are reports given with fake references that are not real. And this goes back to an issue that we have to look at with artificial intelligence before we start looking at what is happening neurologically to students who are utilizing the artificial intelligence for doing their work. And it's a quote that is from the founder of the artificial intelligence, that you should not rely on artificial intelligence because artificial intelligence hallucinates. And it's based off of the fact that what is artificial intelligence doing is it's not actually thinking. It's oxymoronic to call it artificial intelligence because it's not really intelligent. What it's doing is simply taking work and compiling opinions and compiling ideas that it finds throughout the internet sources. And regardless of the validity, regardless of the reliability, regardless of the accuracy of the information, it is drawing those thoughts together and saying this is the correct thought, the correct idea, without regard to the correctness of the thoughts, the correctness of the opinions. It was the issue that when Wikipedia first came out, when students first started having access to all of the internet search engines, when I first started teaching that, I was very hesitant to allow students to use those tools when working on projects, when working on written material. Because you don't know what is the accuracy, what is the validity of the information. It's why for a lot of my current students, I keep telling them, you can't just quote textbooks. You can't just quote random websites. You have to go to the peer-reviewed information where we know at least there is some level of refereeing on the information. And that level of refereeing on the information is going to allow us to have some degree of certainty that the information is relatively valid. And so when we start looking at, okay, as an instructor, I have to be careful in terms of accepting artificial intelligent work, in terms of the authenticity of the author being the student, in terms of who is actually writing the information. And this is where we get a lot of universities, a lot of colleges, a lot of high schools, a lot of school districts coming up with policies about accepting work for authenticity purposes through the artificial intelligence. I'm taking a step back and saying, okay, why is it that we have to worry not about the authenticity of the information, but we have to worry about what is the use of artificial intelligence doing to the ability for the students to critically think and learn? And those are two things that we have to worry about with the reliance on the artificial intelligence. Going back to the use of the search engines, the use of the Wikipedia pages, back when I first started teaching in the early 2000s, the worry wasn't the lack of critical thinking. The worry was the limitations to that first level learning, the learning of the facts. That's where we were concerned that the students would not be able to remember the facts. Now we're not just worried about the students not remembering the facts. Now we're starting to worry about the students not learning how to critically evaluate the facts that are being presented to them. And that's where we have to worry about those two avenues of learning and the impact that artificial intelligence might have on those two avenues of learning. And that's where we have to worry about the literacy skills that the students may not be developing by relying upon the artificial intelligence. One of the things you have to worry about is who is authoring the information for the students to rely on. Well, we have to remember that the artificial intelligence bots are pulling from the internet, pulling from the resources that are out there, generating information from the information that's available. It's not critically evaluating. It's not utilizing literacy skills to determine how valid is that information, how accurate is that information. Is it based on logical fallacies or is it based on logical reasoning? skills that develop when we focus on the critical thinking part of the educational process and not on the factual recall part of the learning process. And this goes back to what we talked about a long time ago in terms of why can't we just focus on the learning when it comes to the learning part of the school, where we overemphasize tests, where we overemphasize assessments, and underemphasize those skills that are necessary in order to show true intelligence. And part of the way in which we can show the true intelligence, part of the way in which we develop that true intelligence is based off of changes that take place within the brain, within the cerebral cortex, during the learning process. The way in which the brain works, the way in which the neural networks work within the cerebral cortex is through what's referred to as nodal connections. That is, where the neurons are going to connect with each other through synaptic connections that make a network of neurons connect to each other. One of the very interesting things that have come out of some of the neuropsychology studies and the neurophysiological studies is that we have these central core neurons that kind of house an image, an idea that will then branch out and connect with other nodal networks to elaborate on that single entity that is contained within that single neuron. The way in which we develop those connection points is through the application of information, through the processing, through the synthesis of ideas that are associated with that single entity, that single idea. But what we don't get when we start relying upon the artificial intelligence is that expanded nodal network, because we are not applying the information. We're allowing the computer to apply the information. We're allowing the computer to develop that nodal network, but that nodal network disappears as soon as that product gets developed by the computer. It's no longer there. It's no longer present. There's no actual critical thinking. There's no actual application taking place. That critical thinking, that application, that nodal branching that's occurring within the network of neurons within the brain is allowing for increased intelligence of the person. And we're talking about increased intelligence. We're not talking about the person that is really good at Jeopardy, the person that's really good at Trivial Pursuit, the person that is a walking flashcard that can just regurgitate information back to you. That's not intelligence, that's memorization. Memorization, even though most students think of this as being a sign of intelligence, is simply that first level of understanding. I can regurgitate a fact, the factual information. And that's what we're getting from the ChatGPT, from the Copilot, from the Gemini. We're getting that factual information back. We're not actually getting synthesis of ideas. We're not actually getting a propagation of new critically thought out material, new synthesis of material by the person. All we're getting is more factual information, more flashcards for the student to look at. When we start looking at this idea about the factual recall versus the application of information, this is where we start looking at where within the cerebral cortex are we getting that nodal connection points and getting that modification taking place within the nodal connection points that allows for improvement in critical thinking, that allows for improvement in memory, that allows for improvement in recall, that allows for improvement in critical thinking. Critical thinking is a skill, and we have to practice that skill all the time in order to be able to apply the factual information to a variety of situations where we have to be able to both deductively reason out a plausible hypothesis as well as inductively reason out a conclusion to empirical observations. And so when we start looking at this idea about what's taking place within the cerebral cortex, within the brain, we start looking at the neural adaptations and the neural modifications that will occur due to the neurons being active. And one of the things that we start looking at, and one of the things that came out in a very recent study about the artificial intelligence and the artificial intelligence as it relates specifically to the brain, thanks to the researchers at MIT, show that we see a reduction in neural activity for individuals that are utilizing that ChatGPT, particularly the students that are utilizing the ChatGPT, as opposed to students who are not utilizing the ChatGPT. And we're going to extrapolate within this discussion here the use of ChatGPT to all of the other avenues of artificial intelligence. And this goes into the idea about How do we know whether or not we know something versus how do we know whether or not we don't know something? And the idea about what do we know and what do we don't know is how are we able to plan and execute to new and novel applications of information? That is, how can we figure out how we're going to respond when we're faced with a situation or faced with a stress that is similar to something that we've seen in the past, but is different than what was seen in the past? Or be able to take diametrically opposing viewpoints and figure out which one, based off of logical reasoning, is the most appropriate viewpoint to follow, the most appropriate viewpoint to actually accept as being true. This is where we start looking at the changes that take place within the neurons, within the brain, and how those changes within the neurons within the brain allow us to develop these neuronal networks that can actually help us with determining which is the correct choice to make, what is the correct information to follow, what is the correct thought to accept as being true. And we start looking at this learning aspect. We start looking at the way in which neurons are changing, that nodal connections within the cerebral cortex to allow for learning to take place. We are going to look at two distinct neuroanatomical and neurophysiological adaptations that occur. The first one we start looking at is what's referred to as synaptogenesis. Synaptogenesis is the production of new nerve connections, new neuron connections, new synapses between neurons that allow for a change in communication, an increase in the speed of communication, or different pathways for communications to take place out of the nodes or within that same nodal network. This allows for information to speed up or slow down to allow for the appropriate response to take place. In that synaptogenesis, we also see changes in the way in which connections are taking place within what's referred to as neuroplastic adaptation or neuroplasticity. That neuroplastic adaptation or neuroplasticity at the synapse side of stuff, at the synaptic junctions, at the connection points between the neurons within that nodal network, takes on what is referred to as a Hebbian synaptic response. That Hebbian synaptic response can get summarized as neurons that fire together stay together. Neurons that do not fire together will die together. And when we're talking about that neuron firing together, staying together, neurons not firing together, dying together, we're talking about how the neural connection points make for a stronger nodal network. And that stronger nodal network is going to reinforce the accuracy of understanding of information, what usually is referred to as factual recall. And that increased ability to have factual recall means that I have a larger reservoir of information to draw from when it comes time to synthesize my own idea, my own thought, stuff that cannot come about if I am simply going to rely upon the artificial intelligence, the computer programs to develop my responses for an assignment. And that's where we have to be very careful in terms of the use of artificial intelligence as the keeper of information or the transmitter of information within the assignments that students are producing, within the work that we are reading, within the work that we are seeing. A lot of people, once again, are more tied up with who is authentically originating that information, not what does it mean about the ability for us to think and comprehend. Not only will it lead to or possibly induce the limited ability to think and to critically evaluate information, one of the things that a lot of the AI generators doing is giving an instantaneous response. And this instantaneous response is going to encourage passive consumption of information. And that passive consumption of information leads to what might seem like engagement with the information, but is really just a superficial engagement. And that superficial engagement is actually going to be weakening the ability for that critical thinking that's necessary in order to establish that nodal connective points that are necessary to allow for greater understanding of information and higher cognitive abilities for the students. And we're really talking about the students here in terms of the learning aspects, more than we're looking at the consumers of information in general population. However, we can extrapolate this to looking at what's going on in terms of the general consumption of information outside of, say, the classroom. One of the things that is constantly evident within the study coming out of MIT is that we get a higher level of interconnectedness within small little clusters within the brain in terms of activations taking place in the student groups that were using the AI. It was noted that even though we get this higher amount of interconnectivity within small clusters, it's that small cluster of higher interconnectivity that actually leads to lower interconnectivity outside of that small cluster. And that higher interconnectivity within the small cluster leading to lower interconnectivity within the larger clusters leads to low ability for integration and low ability for attentional engagement with what is going on within the learning environment, within the materials that they are being exposed to, that leads to a lower than anticipated recall of information. And so there's more informational prompts necessary in order to get the information out. And that the need for having those additional prompts means that you have to go through multiple steps of interconnectedness before you're able to kind of extrapolate or infer the correct information coming into play. And so what we're seeing in terms of the neural scans in these individuals utilizing the artificial intelligence is that they get a kind of a lower level of activity within the cerebral cortex, and that lower level of activity within the cerebral cortex means that they have to have a greater set of cues in order to establish the correct firing patterns within their neurons to elicit the appropriate recall. It's not that they're lazy. It's not that they're uninformed. It's the fact that the connection points that should have been established through the critical thinking that comes about through what the research group called the brain-only learning modes, by stepping aside and not engaging with the information in terms of the learning and utilizing the artificial intelligence to be the guide for the learning. What that AI group was being exposed to limited cues. And this goes into how do we go about learning information, how do we go about retrieving information, how do we go about storing information. And it's based off of cues. And when we talk about cueing, what we're talking about those connections, those nodal points of connection within the cerebral cortex that allows for similar and dissimilar information to be stored in packets, quantas, that are able to be extracted at select points when appropriately cued to be extracted, to be brought from short-term to working in terms of memory, from long-term to short-term to working in terms of memory. That is based off of a whole host of various psychological and psychocognitive functions that are taking place within the cerebral cortex, that when we are utilizing critical thinking applications, we're actively engaged with the information, when we are actively participating in the educational environment, we get this robust increased connectivity across all areas of the cerebral cortex. Even though we think that, okay, we're missing points here and there, what's happening is that the interconnectivity, the robustness of the interconnectivity when we are actively engaged is going to allow for the connectivity to spike and to peak at correct moments. And this is where we start going back to the neural adaptations that take place during the learning phases in what Hebb called Hebbian synapsing, where what we're doing is we're eliminating jitters that take place. That is where we're having asynchronous firing within a synchronous network. And when we're able to minimize the amount of jitter that's taking place within the neural connections that are taking place, we start getting correct neural adaptations. And that correct neural adaptation allows for the patterns and the pathways to be cued very robustly and very quickly because there's minimal amount of jitter taking place. And because there's minimal amount of jitter taking place, what ends up happening is that we start to have correct EEG measures, the brainwave patterns that we look at, that's going to allow for the appropriate level of engagement of neural activity within the brain coming from the critically thinking side of learning, as opposed to I'm going to go and look for the answer on a website, or I'm going to allow the AI instrument to provide the information to me. And so when we start looking at going back to what I was talking about much earlier in terms of the fear that we had when we said, okay, students can use the internet to find information to help them in terms of their factual recall. The information is there, but the thing is that they're still being actively engaged. The lack of engagement with the use of the AI is where we start to see this falter, and that faltering is within the Hebbian connections that should take place, the complexity of connection points that should take place, the complexity within the feedback regulations that are taking place, within the neural networks that allow for extract enhancements, that allow for learning enhancements, that allow for deeper understanding and better critical approach to the information that is taking place. And when we start looking at, okay, who might be utilizing the AI, who might be utilizing the ChatGPT as was used in the MIT study that was out in the public realm in terms of out in the news sources, the natural language capabilities that we want to extract, the contextual abilities, the adaptive responses that we're looking at, the ability to be interactive, and the ability to interplay between ideas starts to drop with the use of these AI instruments. And that's because there's a lack of deeper cognitive engagement. And because there's a lack of deeper cognitive engagement, we get less transference of information. We get less transference of reasoning and poor argumentative functions coming from the individuals versus those that are going to be utilizing critical thinking skills in the development of their thoughts, in the development of their arguments. And so when we start looking at what can we extrapolate from these studies, from this group, and once again, it's a single study, and so we have to be very careful drawing exorbitant amounts of conclusions from the study. But what we can kind of glean from and kind of take away from the studies, from the findings of the brain scans, is that we end up getting a reduction in the ability to apply information. Yes, you're still able to have recall. Yes, you're still able to produce thoughts, but the ability to produce higher critically reasoned, higher critical rationale thoughts starts to drop. The ability to integrate, the ability to attend to various levels of information starts to drop. The scans that we see changes in where within the cerebral cortex we start seeing levels of activity taking place based off of where the information is being integrated, where the information is being processed, where the outward sign of actions happen to be, how the student is responding to the prompts, the response to the questions that they're looking for, the response within the writing responses that they're looking for, in terms of how we're able to go about looking at the ability for higher critical thought process to be exposed, to be shown, where we seem to have lower levels of uniqueness within responses for those who are utilizing the AI. We see lower levels of accuracy coming from the AI. We see slower and lower language development coming from the use of the AI. When we start clustering, as was shown in the study, the responses across various modes, there is a drop in the ability for seeing contextual differences of information in between the person critically problem solving out a response or seeing what is the contextual information being presented versus what we see with the AI generated responses. And that goes into how the AI is being set to run, how the AI is going to be set to differentiate between ideas, because it's the programming within the AI. And so what ends up happening is that when we start looking at this overall activity in this overall cluster of activity within the various connections across the cerebral cortex, across the brain, we see differences in brainwave patterning between the what the study called the brain only group versus the AI group, or the brain only group versus the web search group in terms of their groupings, where the brain only group had significantly greater amounts of brainwave patterns that are associated with attention and systemic processing of ideas, generating creative ideas, what is usually referred as an alpha connectivity. And so this suggests, from the author's perspective, that writing without assistance, that producing thoughts without assistance, that working from an internally driven process generates a greater amount of combined ideas that links memories without external cues, that utilizes external cues to link those combined ideas within the memories, that allow for creativity to come about, that we don't see within the AI group. And that means that, or what the authors are suggesting, and what we can look at in terms of looking at the changes in the brainwave patterning, is that the AI group is actually using the cues from the AI in order to generate their creative ideas. There's less creative burden for the individual, which means that they're not having to link ideas together. They're not having to link cues and memories together in order to form their creative task. In the case of the study, a writing response. Because they've offloaded that to the machine. And because they've offloaded that to the machine, they lose contextualization of the information. The other thing that we start looking at these brainwave patterns, is changes in what's referred to as the beta band patterning. And this is linked with the cognitive processing, the focused thought processing, where it's excessively high with the brain only group. And that's suggesting the sustained cognitive engagement with their work that we don't see with that AI group. And because we don't see with the AI group, it can be an indication that they're not actively engaged with the information. They're not actively processing the information. However, when we start looking at other brainwave patterns, like the delta wave patterns, where the authors are indicating within the study that these patterns are indicating the executive functions being taken under, or the person using executive functions in the processing of information and the execution of information in terms of the production of new information. And so the higher delta connectivity that they show in the brain only group indicates that the participants were more actively engaged with the multisensory integration, the memory related processing, and the formulation of their response. This this delta wave patterning that they're talking about, this oscillations that come about within the the brainwave patterns that we see, might indicate a deeper immersion into the internal thought process that's taking place, that tends to be a self-generated mode of content derivation that the artificial intelligence group did not see, or had intermittent interruptions within the processing that did not allow them to have a sustained level of connectivity. And so the suggestion that the authors are providing to us here is that the unassisted writing, the writing without the AI, provides for a more widespread integration of brain activities that may be slower in terms of some of the integrative process, that may be off-putting for students that do not have the self-motivation and the self-selection and the self-regulation to continue with the task, versus the AI supported group that showed a much more narrow and a much less integrated brain process than what we saw with the brain only group. And so when we start looking at all of these various brainwave patternings taking place, what the scans show is that when we compare the unassisted group to the AI assisted group, the unassisted group had stronger neural connectivity across all of the brainwave bands that are there, in particular with the theta and the alpha bands, that indicates that they were heavily engaged with their own cognitive processes. They were heavily engaged with their own cognitive resources. They were utilizing executive functional areas in an attempt to orchestrate a overarching wider communication network, a more integrated nodal network within the cortical areas that are necessary to have a higher level of working memory necessary for planning and executing the demands that they had put out for the group, which was to write and produce their own material. It's consistent with the ideas about the way in which the networks allow for a change between slow and fast rhythms to allow for a holistic cognitive workload modification. And this is where a lot of educators start looking at what is the cognitive load that I'm placing on students in terms of what do I expect them to do, and how are they going to be able to execute what I'm expecting them to do. And it's that cognitive load that, if we start looking at what the studies are showing us, is that cognitive load is going to separate the smarter, per quotes around that student, from the less smart student or the less smart individual, because the smarter individual is able to modulate through the various levels of workload by changing what areas are highly active versus which areas are less highly active. And so when we start looking at this AI group, they have lower connectivity profiles. They tend to have attenuated the intensity and the scope of the neural communications. They tend to indicate that they're lower in their executive demands. They're facing higher cognitive loads because they're trying to work solely in their working memory, as opposed to utilizing their executive functions to go ahead and switch on and off connective points within the networks to change the rhythmicity that's taking place, to allow for a holistic ability to regulate cognitive load taking place, or the workload taking place within the cerebral cortex, within the brain. And this goes into the need to have a continuous set of self-monitoring within that that prefrontal lobe within the frontal cortex that allows for the executive functions to come into play. We also see changes in terms of how information flows, where we see a bottom-up flow within the group that is not using AI. And the bottom-up flow means that we are flowing from areas where the information is stored to the areas of executive function, back to the areas where information is stored, back to the areas of executive function. And what this can do is this can influence how we interpret the information, and from that interpretation of the information, how we can go about and contextualize that in terms of the storytelling that we use in order to tell what's going on to everybody else. Whereas the individuals that are functioning with the AI, that are functioning with the external inputs, tend to go from a top-down connectivity. That is, they go from the executive areas back to the areas that are storing the information, where the frontal cortex is, instead of orchestrating what's going on, is instead integrating and filtering what is going on and imposing onto other areas the narrative that needs to be told, as opposed to being the conductor of the story being told. And so this is where we have this kind of preparation versus execution going on, where when we're going from the AI top down versus individual bottom up ideas in terms of how the areas flow, the preparation versus execution comes into play. And this is where the preparation versus execution is about how we can have a self-driven, self-monitored responsiveness within the information processing. And it's that self-driven modification, that self-driven monitoring in terms of the information processing is going to allow for the correct level of neural connectivity necessary for the expectations of any type of learning environment. And once again, it goes back to the idea about the cognitive load that a lot of educators like to talk about, where the more cognitive load I have, the slower I'm going to process information, particularly if I do not have that self-monitoring taking place. The external tools, the AI, can cause a disruption in how that load is interpreted. And because it can cause a disruption in how that load is interpreted, it leads to a lower connectivity within the networks. And when we talk about the networks, we're talking about that nodal network that's connecting all of the points, that's allowing for the correct Hebbian processing to take place, the correct synaptogenesis taking place, the correct synaptic pruning taking place, the correct neuroplastic adaptations taking place, that is going to allow for learning to take place. And when we're saying learning to take place, we're not talking about rote learning, we're talking about creative learning. Creative learning is where I'm able to provide context to the information, where it's not necessarily the quantity of information that is being retained at any point in time, but the quality of the information is being retained at any point in time. And that quality of information is based off of the quantity of executive function. When I have lower executive function, such as when I'm using AI, the ability to have a natural executive task output starts to drop. And when we start to have that natural executive function starts to drop, we end up having less intelligence being shown. That doesn't mean that using the AI is going to make anybody automatically less smart. But what it does do is it does reduce the overall neural connectivity taking place. And by reducing the overall neural connectivity taking place, it shifts the flow of information. And by shifting the flow of information, what it does is it shifts how we're going about having neural adaptations taking place. And when we shift how neural adaptations are taking place, we shift the Hebbian connection points, we shift the neural plasticity, and we shift the neural adaptations that allow for intelligence to develop. Not only do we shift the ability for all those neural networks to develop, but we start to weaken the neural connectivity networks. And this is where we have to look at the frequencies of the brainwave patterns and the episodic memory retrievals that are necessary in order to generate creative stories, to generate contextual stories. This is where we have to start looking at one of the things we want to try to retain, one of the things we want to try to build in order to improve learning, improve memory, improve quote unquote smartness. If we want to have an extensive, strong neural network, an extensive, strong neural network allows for internalized cognitive processing to take place with memory retrieval and conceptual integration that allows for us to have variable levels of attention on the information. Whether or not we plan on using the information or not, the information is there and is able to be retrieved. And this is where we start seeing changes with not only just in the number of connections that we have coming off of those neural networks, but the way in which those connections are being held together. And this is where we start looking at the Hebbian synaptic adaptations, leading to changes in the way in which the synapses, the connection points between the neurons are occurring, where we can start having strengthening of the chemical neurotransmitter synapses and convergence of those chemical neurological synapses to electrical neurological synapses that can speed up the transmission and flow of information in the appropriate neural networks that align with the ability to have both recall, but also have contextual, creative, generative effects. That is, we're able to generate a contextual response to the information that we're recalling. We're not just vomiting back information. And that's where we have to remember that learning and smartness is not about Trivial Pursuit. It's not about being a winner on Jeopardy. It's not about memorizing facts. It's about being able to modulate the cognitive load, be able to manage the cognitive load so that areas within the brain that need to be active become more active and areas in the brain that need to be less active become less active, so that we're able to integrate information appropriately along the neural networks so that we're able to have the increased coordination, the increased focal connectivity, the increased activities necessary within the memory circuitry to be able to have intelligence, to be able to interplay between information, to be able to provide symbolic recognitions and symbolic signals to what that information means, so that we're able to produce materials that show what we know to others outside of our own head. Which leads into the final point here, which is the cognitive cost that comes into play. And because of the ever growing level of AI generated information that is feeding the AI generated responses that are feeding into the responses that are seen in terms of this AI assisted thinking, this AI assisted responses that we see within the education world, which we see across the spectrum of responses throughout the population. There's this cognitive cost that comes into play here that we have to be very, very aware of, where we have to understand that the AI will reduce the resistance to provide an answer because the answer is going to be there. The convenience that we can get from having that answer there. If I was to throw a question out to the class and allow the class to have access to all electronic resources, they can very quickly just type in that question into the chatbot and get a response. It's a convenience. It's a convenience that comes at a cognitive cost because it diminishes the inclination to critically evaluate what information is being presented to them, to evaluate the output, to evaluate the opinions. That becomes problematic because the answers are generally being generated by a bot that is generating information from bot generated information. It's a concern because we're developing echo chambers of information, and the echo chambers of information are generating larger echoes. And those larger echoes are not canceling out the echoes the way in which echoes should function in the world of physics, but they're coalescing around each other. And what ends up happening is that topped response that you might get is going to influence what I'm going to think is correct or not. And because it's going to influence what I think is correct or not, is going to influence the thinking that I might have. And so even though we think about this idea in terms of, particularly in the education realm, about the authenticity of the information, it's not really about the authenticity of the information, even though that's important. Ethically, that's important. The problem we have to focus on is, what is it doing to my ability to think? What is it doing to the neural networks within my cerebral cortex, within my brain, that is going to allow me to retain information, to contextualize that information, to expound upon that information, to show my level of intelligence to critically think and to interpret that information in such a way that I'm not automatically assuming that the information that comes to me from a search, particularly from a chatbot search, is automatically correct. Well, thanks for listening. Hope you got a little bit out of the conversation as it relates to AI and how it might be influencing our level of quote unquote smartness and whether it's actually making us less smart. If you like what I'm putting out there, please make sure you give us that thumbs up, that 5-star rating. Make sure you're following us here on the podcast, as well as the stuff that we put out on YouTube, the written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you want us to cover other topics, please make sure you leave them to us in the comments. We'll be more than happy to cover them in future discussions. Please stay tuned for further discussions on the myths and misconceptions we have about the human body and about health in general.